Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I am charged with getting us going again. My name is Otho Kerr. I'm a director in community development with David Erickson and a great team here at the Fed. My title is Director of Strategic Partnerships and Impact Investing. Last summer, I had the good fortune and pleasure of joining a group that joined our president, President John Williams, on a virtual tour of the North Country in New York State. The North Country is this magical part of New York State nestled between the Canadian border and Vermont. It comprises about 20-25% of New York State. And as you can imagine, with the Adirondack State Park in there, it's just this beautiful rural area where connectivity and high-speed broadband and internet is not as common as we'd like. And so there are challenges associated with it. And sure enough, as President Williams talked to folks up there, he learned about the challenges associated with a lack of high-speed internet, the inability to have access to telemedicine, lack of virtual education. From an economic perspective, which was especially important and resonant with us, it served as a barrier to virtual working. For small rural farmers and small businesses, it prevented access to distant markets. So it was a theme that resonated with us, and we knew that we had to do something about it, given our focus on maximizing employment and our focus on a robust economy that works for all segments of society. Here at the bank, we began a series of roundtables where we tried to figure out what were the issues that communities face in terms of closing the digital divide. We convened experts from think tanks. We convened community participants and leaders. We convened folks from the private sector and the public sector. And I have to say that we were pretty late to the party. We have fellow sister banks throughout the system who have been focused on closing the digital divide for a while. And I want to lift up in particular a great colleague of ours in Kansas City, Jeremy Hegley, who has been coordinating a few banks who have been focused on this issue. And we're now part of that group. And needless to say, he wrote a chapter in this book that we've been focusing on today, Investing in Rural Prosperity. The chapter is called Bringing Broadband to Rural America, the Role for Philanthropy. And Jeremy notes that when it comes to closing the digital divide, there are essentially two issues. One is access and availability, and the other is the barriers to adoption. Access and availability is that notion that any business or individual who wants access can have access, even if expensive. And adoption are those issues associated with if an individual has access but does not have broadband subscription, well, there's some barrier to adoption. It might be affordability. It might be a lack of trust in ISPs. It might not be due to a lack of the right devices that provide access. And so we've all been focused on what can we do to address access and availability and to address adoption, especially in rural communities. Today we have with us two individuals, and do we have David Wolf connected? I just want to make sure he is connected.
Yes, I am.
Great, okay. Before I introduce you, I just wanted to make sure you were there, the magic of high-speed internet. I have with us today two wonderful people, two people I can't imagine being better to help lead a discussion on what we need to do, at least in New York State, to improve access and availability and to remove the barriers to adoption. I have with me the acting director of New York State's Connect All initiative, which is a $1 billion effort focusing on making sure that all New Yorkers have access to high-speed, affordable internet, Scott Rasmussen. And I also have on the internet, as you can hear, David Wolf, who is the founder of 80K Action, which is a community-based group up in the Adirondacks in the North Country. He has terrific experience in this area. He will bring a more local perspective. But to get us going, I'm going to ask Scott Rasmussen to tell us about what he's been up to on behalf of New York State to move us toward a
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm going to get up so that I can move around a bit more freely to give a presentation about what we're up to. But my name's Scott Rasmussen. As Otho mentioned, I'm the acting director of New York State's Connect All initiative, which is a $1 billion public investment in broadband, trying to expand access to all New Yorkers. I'm going to try to speed through this a little bit, but at least so that we all have some background knowledge about how we got here, where we're at, and where we're heading. So we kicked off this year the Connect All initiative in New York State, and it started to think about this issue a lot more comprehensively. Traditionally, a lot of broadband discussion has been simply a rural-urban divide, and that we just need to extend broadband infrastructure a little bit further into New York State to be able to get everyone connected. And we're realizing, I think people are waking up to the fact, especially after COVID, that that doesn't entirely solve the problem. There are lots more barriers to access, and I should read Jeremy's piece in the book to be able to learn a little bit about them. But as mentioned, we're thinking about this in three big ways. One is capital investments. The other is around how do we use state assets? What do we have already in New York State? Public rights of ways, buildings, other types of initiatives, even people power in local communities, capacity that we can build off of. And then how do we solve affordability and equity issues? There are, I think New York City was just looking at this matter a year or two ago and found 1.8 million residents of New York City do not have access to either a home broadband subscription or a cell phone. That is an incredible number of people left on the wrong side of the digital divide. So we need to be thinking about this holistically. Just very quickly to look back, this is a quick slide about some of the investments that we've done in New York State. The biggest one I want to highlight here is a $500 million investment that we did in 2015. That was investing in rural broadband deployments across the state. New York State was doing rural broadband deployment, I think, before it was cool. In 2015, we were starting to set up that program, and we've been successful in extending broadband access to 256,000 households across the state as part of that. And then looking ahead to what we're doing now. We have been investing entirely in expanding rural broadband infrastructure, and we need to continue doing that. There's still well over 100,000 households across New York State that lack access or basic availability to broadband, and I'm joined by Dave Wolf in the North Country, who's more of an expert than even I am on these issues and has been working on them for years. But we also have to think about things like competition. How do we drive down prices? How do we make the marketplace more competitive and build to make a more robust broadband ecosystem in the state? And thinking about future-proof technologies. Where are we going to be in 30 years? In many ways, broadband and broadband infrastructure are the road systems, the ports that really drove economic success in the 20th century. And we need to be thinking in New York State how to set ourselves up to take advantage of the 21st century connected economy. This, just for our initiative in New York State, very briefly, these are the funding sources. We are incredibly excited that the feds have finally taken some real action on this issue, invested real money in it. $42.5 billion will be coming into broadband investment across the United States. We are leveraging that as well as with $300 million led by Governor Kathy Hochul in this year's budget to be able to further expand the success of that. I have some information here just on some of the initiatives we're planning, but not to get into too much detail. Our first priority is building local capacity. We need local solutions. Local communities know best what the obstacles are to broadband adoption and access in their communities and should be empowered to be able to lead on the solutions. And in many cases, local communities don't have the capability, access to technical assistance, things they need to be successful in that space. And then we have the capital infrastructure investments. So 21st century municipal infrastructure, that's looking at publicly owned broadband systems, much like the roads of today. How do we invest to make sure these communities are building out infrastructure that's accessible to all, as well as continuing with the work that we've done in rural broadband for the last number of years to make sure that that broadband is available at every household across New York State. And finally, we're trying to look ahead. How do we think differently how to leverage these resources? Is that 5G, 6G? I'm actually part of conversations happening here in New York City at research institutions trying to think next generation technology. So how do we set ourselves up to be successful in that? And then finally, additionally, we're thinking about affordability. So we need to be talking about digital equity. We need to be talking about those other barriers to access that Otho was talking about, looking at affordable housing, digital equity programming, training, these types of things. And finally, looking at leveraging state assets. So what types of resources do we already have? We repealed the DOT fiber fee, so we were actually assessing a fee on fiber optic cables in the public right-of-way in New York State for the last couple of years. We threw that out, said we needed to lower the cost of deployment, make it easier for companies to be able to invest in this infrastructure. Another exciting one that I'll just highlight here is we learned that we had already in New York State over 700 miles of fiber optic cable along NYPA's or New York State Power Authority's transmission wires. Why can't we open up access to that to try to empower communities? So what do we have as a state that we can bring to the table to advance this issue? There's a couple other ones here, but in all, our goal is to get every New Yorker connected over the next couple of years, and we're putting our money where our mouth is to try to do so. And that's my quick presentation of where we were, how we got here, and happy to sit down and turn it back over to you.
Thanks so much, Scott. New York State has been a real leader in this area, and thank you for putting us at the front in terms of where the states are today. I want to bring David Wolf on. Can we do that? There he is. Hey, David.
Can you hear me also?
Yes, you have a standing room only crowd waiting to hear every word. David, I have had the joy of having a few conversations with David. David is this burst of energy and enthusiasm leading efforts to close the digital divide up in the North Country. David, tell us a little bit about ADK Action, how you started it, and what your focus is in terms of closing the digital divide.
Well, ADK Action, I helped establish the organization. I'm a current board member of ADK Action. It's a nonprofit. We create innovative projects to meet unmet needs, promote vibrant communities, and preserve the natural beauty of the Adirondacks. We focus on projects that have broad support, water quality, emergency food access, road salt, and of course, good old broadband. I'm the current board chair of the Broadband Committee. It's my passion. And our goal is how can we achieve universal access to high-speed broadband throughout the North Country? And we shorthand that by saying our goal is 100 at 100. We want 100% of the households and businesses in the North Country to have access to 100 meg or better.
And David, tell us a little bit about your story and how you and your wife got to be doing the work that you're doing today.
Fair enough. I was born and raised in Saranac Lake here in the middle of the Adirondacks. As Rob talked about earlier in his presentation, like so many, after college and a tour with Uncle Sam, I left. I went to San Francisco, joined IBM, met Holly, my wife, at IBM out in San Francisco. After 65 years with IBM between the two of us, we said enough's enough in 2006, and we retired back to Saranac Lake. After getting married, we discovered that both sets of our parents had done a very good job of instilling in us the desire, if you will, wherever we live, to leave the place better than we found it. We also found that once we got back to Saranac Lake, that the skills we had learned at IBM, we could really make a difference in the North Country, in the Adirondack Park, through our volunteer work. So we ended up sort of kidding ourselves. We went from full-time paying jobs to full-time non-paying jobs, working for a fair number of volunteer organizations, Olympic Museum, a production theater in Saranac Lake, Family Foundation, Lake Association, the Adirondack Foundation, and ADK Action, my favorite. My time at IBM also showed me how important access to broadband was to my own personal career. So when I get back to Saranac Lake, it became, unfortunately, in 2006, painfully obvious that high-speed broadband access was abysmal. And so it became my passion. What can I do to really turn that one around? And it seemed to me that from an economic investment standpoint, it made a lot more sense to, if you will, invest in the infrastructure for broadband than it would make, bringing a factory into the Adirondacks, as an example. So that's been my focus. And then, of course, the pandemic hit, and now everybody in the world understands broadband access, high-speed broadband access. It's not just a nice to have, it's a necessity.
And David, Scott was talking about building local capacity and the importance of having communities sort of lead the way, lead the charge. But I think one thing that we know, and David likes to talk about this, David Erickson, who runs community development here, he will talk about the need for a quarterback who leads local efforts if you want to see change. What I love about your experience and your wife Holly's experience is that you have come in as kind of co-quarterbacks to help lead the charge. Perhaps you can tell us what you're focused on and what Holly's focused on in terms of leading that change.
Well, from my perspective, back to my passion with broadband access, it's been over 10 years now. I've been hosting a monthly call where we share status of broadband throughout the North Country, kind of best practices, you name it. We share that with over 160 people, interested citizens, elected officials, broadband providers. And we also include people from the state, like Scott, and federal broadband-related agencies. And so we've developed this network of people that are interested in broadband in the North Country, a network where people feel comfortable, they trust each other. People that now understand what's going on and what are some of the challenges and how do we work together to overcome those challenges. Bottom line, knowledge has really become power. And this establishing trust in the collaboration, one of my best examples is we have developed something called the North Country Broadband Alliance, which is a set of counties in the North Country working with broadband providers, providers that are big, small, fiber providers all the way down to fixed wireless. And they're working together to try and figure out where are the unserved, underserved, and how do we go about, solving the problem together, collaboratively.
And you're missing the other quarterback, Holly. What I loved
She's
about
sitting over here.
But what I loved about you, when you and I spoke previously, you talked about your focus on accessibility and her focus on the barriers to adoption and creating digital equity, if you will.
Yes, she is on the board of Adirondack Foundation, and they are a foundation across the North Country providing resources to a number of important programs, things like Birth to Three. How do you, that first 1,000 days is so critical to the development of people. And what can we do to improve the daycare capabilities that exist in the North Country so that you can allow, people to then go and work. They don't have to worry about taking care of their children, as an example. As said before, it's the adoption side of it has to do with, can I afford it? Do I have the equipment? And do I have the knowledge? And there's some things coming down from the feds in particular that will help us with the affordability and with the equipment. On the knowledge side, as mentioned earlier in some of the talks, when you're in rural parts of especially in the North Country, some traditions die hard, and you run into people that from pride. I don't want people to know that I need help. That's a real issue that we sometimes run into, and so we're working to see if we can bring the I'll call it education and the knowledge of what programs are out there to help people help themselves.
Thanks, David. When we began this journey at the Fed 9 months ago to figure out what our role could be in terms of moving the needle, an area of focus of ours was affordability. But recently, the White House has effectively taken that issue off the table. Maybe, Scott, you can describe the recent announcement that came out of the White House 2 weeks ago, which I don't think got a whole lot of visibility considering its import.
Sure. It's a program called the Affordable Connectivity Program, and it was rolled out as part of the infrastructure bill. It is a $30 a month discount on broadband services, but the White House was able to effectively get most of the largest providers in the country to sign on and saying, if you qualify for that program, I think the number is 200% federal poverty rate or a number of other qualifiers to be eligible, that you essentially can have free home internet. And so that gets rid of a huge barrier to access and really changes the game. It has been a huge part of our mission. Now, if you in New York State register for a driver's license or renew your driver's license, you get informational materials about this program. So we've been kind of driving in any way that we can to get the word out. I think that most folks don't know that this program exists. In New York State, we have about 2.25 million households that qualify for this program. There's about 800 or 900,000 now who have enrolled. We're leaving a lot of money on the table every month in New York State, and I'm sure states all across the country are, to be able to take advantage of this. And it's a real mission of ours to try to get folks enrolled and the information out there.
It's really important to get that information out there. Effectively, about 41% of households in the United States qualify for this. And what it does is that it effectively makes the cost of high-speed internet $0 for these families, but they have to be aware of it, and that's part of the adoption issue, just making sure folks understand the opportunities that are available to them. So I'm interested, Scott and David, from your perspectives, from the state perspective, David, from a local perspective, what are the opportunity costs that people, I mentioned a few at the beginning, but what are some of the real opportunity costs that folks are seeing on the ground? What are the lived experiences that, what are they saying? What are the opportunity costs of not being connected to high-speed internet?
I'll let David lead that off because he works on these issues every day across the North Country.
Well, a classic example, pandemic hits, and the use of telemedicine just goes through the ceiling. I've heard it was like 10% before the pandemic to 100% after it hit. What we found is 30 to 40% of the telemedicine sessions after the pandemic hit failed. Then the issue really came down to broadband speed, bandwidth. For a session to hold where you can actually get paid for it as a physician, you have to have dual sessions. You have to have a session with the patient, and you need a separate connection to also check, blood pressure, glucose levels, what have you. And 30 to 40% of the time in the North Country, we didn't have enough bandwidth to hold that session open. And so what that meant is the patient, if you will, now had to either drive or find someone to drive them. It could be 20, 30, 40 miles to get to the healthcare professional. They had to expose themselves during the early phases of the pandemic to working with strangers and maybe getting sick. And of course, they had to delay getting their healthcare taken care of. So you end up with, because of a lack of high-speed broadband access, I am not reducing my healthcare cost, and I'm putting people's health at risk.
Scott, what else have you witnessed?
Yeah, I would add to that the business side of this for small business development. Cellular access across the North Country is an enormous challenge. It's something that we've really focused on in New York State. You cannot run a small business, especially in a tourism-based economy, if nobody has cell access. It's incredibly hard to drive business and those types of necessary things. So the connectivity costs, I think, for small businesses, particularly if we want folks to be successful in local economies, rural economies, that connectivity piece is essential. The other side that I'd raise is just from the municipal perspective. There are a lot of initiatives across the state and elsewhere talking about smart city development and all of these different technologies that we can take advantage of that simply aren't possible if you don't have the fiber backhaul, if you don't have this basic infrastructure present in a community. And as things change over the next 10, 15, 20 years, if that equation doesn't change significantly, it just expands the digital divide, I think, between urban and rural spaces with respect to who can take advantage of these technologies, get online, be able to assist their communities.
And David, anything else we're missing that we should lift up?
Yeah, as I said, the pandemic is the old Maslow 101. It's no longer a nice to have, it's an absolute necessity. Telecommuting, telemedicine, teleschooling, you name it. You can't live in today's world without access to high-speed broadband.
Great, thanks. So we talked about access, we talked about barriers to adoption. What are some of the solutions to creating that access that we're talking about? And maybe you can at first describe what are the issues that prevent increased access in the North Country. Perhaps, David, you might want to take a stab at that. What are the issues that prevent the infrastructure that we'd like to see up there?
Let me back up for a second and just to sort of set the stage to know the marketplace, as it were. Scott, I think, mentioned in your presentation, Scott, that New York State's done a good job. The Connect All office, the broadband program office before that, of getting most of New York to access to high-speed broadband. Supposedly got 2% or so left, but that's 100,000 households, and a lot of those households are up here in upstate New York in the North Country. And we have a relatively small population. In the Adirondack Park, there's 132,000 permanent residents. And so that unserved, underserved percentage really impacts us up here. And I'd like to just make sure we're all on the same page with regard to the Adirondacks, what this area is like. You got over 6 million acres, okay? We're the largest state park in the continental United States. You could take Yosemite, Yellowstone, Glacier, the Grand Canyon, the Great Smokies, put them all together, it's smaller than the Adirondacks. Hamilton County, in the center of the park, has 3 people per square mile. That's the lowest population density in the eastern United States. You've got hamlets in the Adirondacks that are food deserts. People can't get access to fresh food, vegetables, meats. They have to go over 20 miles to find it. You've got, as I said earlier, healthcare road trips require a drive of 20, 30, 40 miles to get to your healthcare professional. The Saranac Lake School District, it has kids coming from 3 counties. It's the physically largest school district in the state, bigger than Suffolk County. So you've got this mountainous area, you've got a low population density, and you've got the good old Adirondack Park Agency regulations preventing tower heights, if you will. And so you're really impacting what you can do you're making broadband network expansion really difficult.
Obstacles or solutions?
How about the obstacles?
You know, if you had asked me that question 3 years ago, I would have just said capital, capital, capital. Because broadband is incredibly expensive. I think that's why in many cases, most states and many areas haven't stepped up yet. People have done mapping initiatives, asset inventories. There's this whole list of things that I think legislatures have tended to think about because they don't want to spend hundreds of millions of dollars that it ultimately takes to be able to do this. To give an example, in New York State, we invested $500 million in it. We were matching private investments 80 cents on the dollar. So that's, I think, gives a sense of exactly how challenging this environment can be able to operate in. But coming out of COVID and out of the pandemic and thinking more about this, the other biggest obstacle is local capacity. I think what David is doing is incredible in North Country, organizing people around this. If communities aren't empowered in thinking about how to solve broadband problems and overcome those obstacles, they're going to continue to be left behind in many ways. And I think that our job at the state or even at the Fed and elsewhere is to try to find ways to empower these local communities to actually be the leaders and identify what the problems are, come up with the solutions. And so we need to be focused much more on capacity and obviously capital investments.
So let's assume there's a town upstate, not in the North Country, but somewhere upstate near the Finger Lakes, and they're interested in broadband. They haven't identified a quarterback yet who's going to move the needle, but they have an interest and there's a need. What happens to them?
Historically, not much. It's ended there, right? We are now, as I mentioned in our presentation, we're starting to look at these planning grants, trying to give communities funding to be able to do needs assessments, and then kind of phase 2 of that, connecting them with technical assistance and things of that nature to be able to get consulting help to try to look at how do we actually solve the problem? What's the real nuts and bolts? Do we need to bring in engineers and things of that nature? It takes persistent work. You know, as David can mention, it's years. These projects take 5-6 years, so you need an incredibly dedicated community, a lot of local infrastructure. I think our perspective is increasingly kind of let 1,000 flowers bloom in New York State. Let's get every community at least a vision statement, an understanding of what's needed locally, and then start working from there on how to empower them. What are the resources that they need? Because the problems in Rochester are vastly different than the problems in the North Country, are vastly different than the problems in Queens. So we really need to be empowering those local folks to identify what the problems are, and then we can actually really talk about solutions.
Do you have any examples, Scott, of any communities, large or small, that have taken the initiative and have done some really innovative or exciting things in New York State that you want to hold up?
Sure. We have in Jamestown, New York, and upstate, has been incredibly active on this issue. Their mayor has just put out, I think last month, a feasibility study on connecting every single resident in their municipality. They operate an electric grid, they're a municipal electric co-op, building out infrastructure so that they not only get the smart grid benefits of connecting everybody with fiber, but then connect everybody at home too. Give every resident access, and when you have an electric bill, you have a small bill for your broadband as well on top of that. With ACP, you could probably bring that to zero for many folks in this community since they're really low income. That's the kind of creative, out-of-the-box solutions that I think we need to be doing more of. I think the kind of traditional approach has been, great, how much money can we throw at the problem? You know, we're just going to build out some more infrastructure and hope that that kind of solves it. And I think we're realizing that that doesn't solve all the problems. We kind of need that sustained engagement by local communities.
One idea that we've seen bubbling up throughout the United States is this idea of municipal broadband networks run by municipalities. We've seen some do well, some they have challenges. Do you have any thoughts on, and perhaps you can describe for the audience what these municipal broadband networks are, how they're unique, and what benefits they may provide?
Sure. I will say they take many different forms. Depending, again, they're really driven by local circumstances. Here in New York, we have, I believe above 30 municipalities that operate their own electric grid, for example. May be very easy. They already own the bucket trucks. They already own the infrastructure. Throw up some fiber cables. They have a billing structure. All these things are really solved. So in that case, it may make sense for the municipality or the electric cooperative itself to be able to sell broadband access.
But essentially, the municipalities are the ISPs.
The ISP,
right?
exactly. In other cases, it may be building out infrastructure, leasing it to a number of providers. I think in Utah, there's an example, Utopia Fiber. They kind of build out the infrastructure, lease it to a variety of ISPs who then compete on price, service, and variety of different things. But in that case, right, everybody at home has 9, 10 different competing ISPs for their service. That's a great deal for consumers, right? If we can make that happen, that's really good for the end user. That ultimately pays off. And so I think it looks a little bit different in every community, but we're certainly in New York. I think we believe that this is the kind of investments we need to be successful in the 21st century. It is not enough to just have one provider in town that kind of dictates. As I mentioned, if you're looking ahead to things like smart city developments in a municipality, okay, how do we, deploy technology in new ways? If you just have one provider in town, that provider kind of dictates what the realm of possibility is. And so I think trying to empower communities, not only with that local planning aspect I was talking about, but with real capital, real hundreds of millions of dollars, real money into the game to be able to invest in that infrastructure is going to be essential for our kind of long-term future in the state.
David, what have you seen that you consider to be innovative, an innovative solution to bringing broadband access to communities?
The thing that our saving grace up here is the regional carriers. They are the ones that go the extra mile. What is most important is sort of the holy grail, if you will, about broadband access is finding out where are the pockets of unserved, underserved. And it's the old null set, I'm going to send out an email. If you didn't get it, raise your hand. So it's my advice to any town official or county official, and what we're focused on, sort of laser focused, is we've got to identify where these people are that still need service and where's the closest provider to get to them. And what we found with the regional guys, where we find a pocket of unserved, underserved, we find creative solutions to get to them. Example, if you have high-speed broadband to the edge of a lake, and there's a lot of lakes up here, you can get around the lake real easily. And we've got a number of situations where we're literally beaming and rebeaming signals from one shore and picking up hundreds of homes in the process. So that's one of the most creative solutions I've seen.
I think David raises a really important point, which is just good data. It has been a huge challenge in this space to just even know who is unserved, who's underserved, what's the cost. It's just there's been so much that we haven't known, and folks are really just waking up to the fact that now the feds are working on a broadband coverage map. New York State is working on a broadband coverage map. I think in the next year, for the very first time, we'll really have a good sense of who has access, who doesn't, where investment is needed. And obviously, I don't have to tell the folks in this room that good data guides good investment, and that's going to be necessary to kind of get these last folks online.
In an area where were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, my advice to the any town official is right now is the best thing you can do is make sure you have GIS capability, that you have identified every household and business in your town, longitude and latitude on that map, and that you have identified the provider networks that exist by road, by street, where do they end. When you have that kind of information, it's very clear who's remaining unserved, underserved, and now you know where they are, who they are, how many there are there, and who's the closest provider, and you can come up with a cost case to figure out how do I get from A to B and solve the problem.
In the next few months, we're hoping to have digital asset maps which show where folks are served and underserved, which will allow for some critical decision-making and policy-making and funding. One really exciting area that has come out of the infrastructure bill is a digital equity grant opportunity, which will allow communities that have been traditionally underserved and not have access to high-speed internet. It gives community states and territories the opportunity to apply for grant funding, which will allow not only for infrastructure and access, but plans to help underserved communities gain access in a way they might not have otherwise. I don't know if you want to talk about the digital equity plan.
Sure. We're just embarking on this in New York State. We have to develop a state digital equity plan that really assesses various historically disadvantaged populations, thinks about, okay, what are the unique circumstances impacting this community, and now what's needed to be able to make sure that they get online. In some cases, that may be availability, like we were talking about, is there infrastructure in front of their home? In other cases, it may be things like access to a device, digital literacy training, trust. Do you trust your providers? Do you live in affordable housing in New York City and have had folks come by and say, hey, this, and pitch you on an idea, and you're like, I'm not going to sign up for this. Or you get something in the mail. A great question for everybody in the room. If you get something in the mail that says, this free service, you should sign up for it, the first thing I do is throw that into the recycling bin. There is no way that I'm going to sign up and give my information to somebody advertising a free service. I don't think we should have that expectation. So going back to the ACP and the Affordable Connectivity Program, simply saying, oh, internet's now free, sign up, isn't sufficient. I wouldn't sign up for it, and I doubt many of the people in this room would. So we need to be doing that door-to-door work to get folks educated, understanding with trusted partners, saying that yes, this is a real thing. This is something that you can enroll in, try it out. And that not only is about trusted partners, it's about word of mouth. It's about getting those quarterbacks that you're mentioning in every community kind of leading the charge. And I think that's the work that we're going to be trying to do on digital equity once we get a state plan together is, okay, how do we deploy funds to try to get those quarterbacks in place? How do we deploy funds to kind of empower those local trusted providers or people in any community to be able to say, hey, this is a good idea. Here's how you can pursue this.
Thanks, Scott.
And what I'm doing on that part is, it turns out there's a number of digital equity and inclusion coalitions around the state. I'm working with Heidi Zimmer out of the Western New York to try and bring those coalitions together in a network so that you have representation from around the state focused on digital inclusion and equity that can then work with Scott as we try and make sure that New York gets more than its fair share, if possible, of the $2.75 billion that's going to be available for that.
Thanks, David. Real quickly, you had mentioned to me earlier, David, and you talked about at one point capital was an issue, funding was an issue. Right now, funding isn't really much of an issue. We're sort of rolling in cash in terms of broadband. But there's a capacity issue. Maybe you can just talk about that for a bit.
Yeah, everybody is gearing up. I can say everybody in state government, we're part of a state broadband leaders network, is talking about this issue right now. It's about workforce and supply chain issues. Right now, we just talked to a small provider that's trying to deploy fiber. They have a 52-week quote to be able to get fiber inventory to be able to deploy. So we may have the cash and ready to pay for it right now, but it's like, great, the delivery is coming in 52, 54 weeks, and then we're going to be able to deploy this. So number one, supply chain issues, I think, are going to be a huge challenge and really underappreciated. And under promise, over deliver, I think, is the name of the game in a lot of this. Folks that are saying, great, you're going to have broadband in 2-3 years, aren't acknowledging, I think, some of the supply chain issues. And then the other side, workforce. New York State is going to be competing with 49 other states on kind of a limited workforce. And we were talking a little bit about this. This is a once in a generation opportunity in deployment. There's going to be more demand now for kind of telecommunications workforce needs than there probably will be for the next 30 years. And so how do you approach that workforce issue is going to be very challenging. If we're training new folks, we'd like to promise them a long-term future in this sector. And so how are we going to navigate that as essential? We're going to be competing for out-of-state workers to try to attract them and their contractors and firms to come to New York State. And so I think a part of that is actually a good argument for why you need strong labor protections, why we should be ensuring kind of good pay for these workers, because we're going to have to compete with a lot of folks to be able to get these people in state. Frankly, we want to support New York State workforce. We should be doing that. That is 100% our mission. But the fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, we're gonna probably need more than what's available in the state.
Hey, Otho, I'd like to delta off one of Scott's points. Is right now New York State is competing for federal money with the other states. And so in that realm, what's called cost per passing becomes very important. And New York, I think, could do more, not to connect all office, but some other parts of the government to reduce the cost per passing. What's a passing? It's a service to a new house, to a new business. And things like right now, there's a DOT survey requirement for fiber installations along state highways that's adding thousands of dollars to the cost to expand the network. There's the whole, what's called make-ready process where in the North Country, most of our broadband is on poles. It's aerial. And so you have to work with the pole owners, that's the phone companies, electric companies, to be able to put your fiber on the pole. That process was regulated. It is de facto deregulated today, and the costs have gone through the ceiling such that it now costs more than 50% of per mile to expand broadband goes to the make-ready pole owner process. And the state could also do some, I'll call it positive things like tax breaks for providers that are providing service to pockets of unserved, underserved. So I think the things that the state of New York itself could continue to do to help us be more competitive going after the monies, et cetera, that are now becoming available.
Thanks, David. I need to wrap this up. I'm going to ask you each one question. What would you like us to leave this room remembering when it comes to closing the digital divide? What's that one nugget you want us to remember?
Local capacity, that the biggest challenge in this space isn't going to be workforce challenges. It's not going to be supply chain. It's going to be the ability of local communities to clearly identify the obstacles that they have and think about creative out-of-the-box solutions to fix them. Because frankly, we wouldn't be here if the problem was already solved. We have 30 years of, in many cases, failed policy in telecommunications. We need to be doing things differently, and that begins with local solutions from these communities, and people need to be thinking creatively, building that capacity, organizing their network, and engaging people on this issue. It's happening now because people are recognizing the importance of broadband, but we need to keep up that steam. We need to make sure it continues.
Thanks, Scott. And David?
I go back to the data side of it. It's absolutely crucial to understand who's unserved, where are they located, and who's the closest provider to them. I can't solve the availability problem until I understand the magnitude of the problem, and that is understanding the pockets of unserved, underserved. And once I understand where they are, I can get creative solutions to solve it.
You both have been amazing. Continue the work that you do. David, great stuff up there. Thank Holly for us. Scott, thank you for all that you do. A great heroine has been in my life Ella Baker and what she did in the civil rights movement. And a quote of hers, which I love, is "Give light and people will find the way." I say, provide connection and people will find a way. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.